Okay, so I'll walk you through preliminary results by research question. The first was, how do stakeholders define the shark problem? The first thing I want to focus on is that people have different ways of talking about sharks. Given our research question, we'll be focusing on more of the problematic aspects of sharks, but these are all of the different ways people talked about them. Not important that you read all of this, just note that there are negative perceptions people have of sharks or negative impacts from sharks in orange, but there are also positive impacts or benefits that people describe sharks providing there in blue, and also neutral ways that people talk about sharks that aren't inherently good or bad. This is just a different way to represent the same data by stakeholder group. From left to right, we have fishers, fisher researchers, fisher managers, and researchers. We can see there's wide use of negative descriptors across stakeholder groups. What's interesting is that compared to others, the fisher researchers describe sharks more using neutral terms, less using positive terms, and the researcher group describes sharks using positive terms more than other groups. These two groups are the most different despite their shared researcher identities. Again, same data, but here we're displaying it for reef versus pelagic sharks. People did talk about reef sharks as problematic. For example, some spearfishers reported increasing aggression and signs of conditioning in reef species. But when reef and pelagics were talked about relative to one another, pelagics were usually identified as more problematic for fishers. I'll have lots of quotes throughout these results taken from interviews, and for the sake of time I'll go quickly through the slides, but you can always pause the videos to read them in more detail. We know there are clear on the water impacts that sharks have on fisheries, but there are many different ways people talked about the problems they associate with sharks. So those in blue refer to on the water impacts. Catch and gear loss are big ones there. Wedges in red represent secondary impacts, and those in orange represent contextual issues. That last wedge, waste, refers to some people talking about their concerns about sharks going to waste if they were being caught or killed and they didn't have something to use it for. We'll go into a bit of detail on some of these, but what I want you to take away from this is that the impacts fishers are experiencing on the water make up a little over half the shark problem. As the distribution and behavior of sharks changed through time, people talked about changing the way they fished, fishing further or avoiding fishing spots they used to frequent, for example. Many on-the-water losses in gear, catch, and time translate to financial costs to fishers, and it's notable that the impact of a shark encounter may hurt more if you've invested more in your fishing gear, fuel, materials, etc., which varies by fishery. Across stakeholder groups that I spoke to, there was agreement around a need to understand sharks better in this region. This was pointed out in terms of a lack of data and research in the area, around shark movement and interaction rates, why things have changed through time, and what species are present. Studies that have been done in this region indicate declining or relatively low reef shark abundance compared to other Pacific islands. There's been no published research on pelagic shark populations that I know of, and I believe the only data we have on fisher-shark interactions comes from the past few years of Guam DWR creel surveys. Of course, fishers have their own ways of documenting these interactions, but they haven't been compiled in a systematic, consistent way. I think there's great potential for that. I drafted a data sheet and started collecting fishers' reports and photos of depredation and gear loss from sharks. But I think for an effort like that to be successful, there needs to be a more dedicated effort to collect that data, keep people engaged, and also compare those interactions to fishing activity where interactions aren't occurring. There's some unpublished shark interaction data that I've heard of in discussions with people in the Marianas, but these data weren't collected using traditional fishing methods or stimuli. And then there are ongoing DNA swabbing efforts to identify the species of shark interacting with fisheries. That's being done out of UOG and HIMB's Carl Meyer. Here I have the different ways people talk about problems around shark interactions, again by stakeholder group. Those with fishing experience emphasize on the water impacts a bit more. But what's interesting is, again, that the fisher researcher and researcher groups appear to differ the most, where you have fisher researchers discussing direct impacts more than any other group, and contextual issues less than any other group, while researchers display the opposite pattern. So again, different people talking about sharks in different ways. People also have different theories about how and why shark interactions are changing through time. A prominent reason why sharks are recognized as a problem is because people making observations recognize a departure through time from what has been their normal experience. If we look at overlap between discussions of changes to shark interactions through time and other shifts in the fishery, we see that sharky changes are associated most with these four themes. And they don't necessarily represent relationships of cause and effect, but they were talked about together, so might provide some insight into how these different changes are related. The first is fish abundance and size. People talked about this decreasing through time, which might have affected shark behavior, making them quote-unquote hungrier. Most of this decline in fish abundance and size was talked about with regard to reef fish, but there were some cases where people who have been fishing for several decades noted similar trends in pelagic and deep bottom fish. Most people talked about shark finning bans and other shark protections contributing to an increase in shark abundance. Some people talked about fishing participation increasing or decreasing over time, but as related to shark changes, people talked about more people fishing overall being associated with increasing shark interactions and impacts to fisheries. Finally, people talked about sharks' movement and distribution changing according to FAD's distribution through time. So again, people have different theories about how and why shark interactions are changing. And people attributed changes in their observations to either increase in shark abundance or changing shark behavior. Those that perceived an increasing abundance referenced sightings of more sharks at a time, seeing them more frequently and in more areas. And there was some tension around whether or not shark abundance is increasing between fishers and scientists, as this quote illustrates. But this same tension was found within the fishing community as well. And some even commented that social media could be contributing to the perception that sharks are increasing. There seemed to be more agreement around the idea that shark behavior is changing through time. People talked about sharks being conditioned, being more responsive to fishing sounds and smells than before. They talked about new fish species being depredated, where before sharks would traditionally go after bloody tuna. Now they're going after things like mahi, wahoo, and marlin, which was really unusual in the past. And then people talked about how sharks are attacking bare lures now, which is also a new phenomenon. The takeaway here is that current and future research might help us to understand changes in shark abundance, especially for pelagic sharks, for which little to no research has been done. But I think right now what we have to work with are these quite specific observations of shark behavior, and it could be more productive and unifying to structure our discussions around behavioral changes and how those are impacting fisheries, while we also start to think about how to create some baseline for shark abundance. I'll leave you with the key points from this video, and in the next video we'll address research question 2.